At 72, Franco Harris stood as a man both celebrated and shadowed. To the world, he was the face of resilience, the author of the Immaculate Reception, the man who carried the Pittsburgh Steelers into an age of destiny. Yet beneath the golden light of Lombardi trophies, Harris carried truths he rarely spoke aloud. Truths about betrayal, rivalry, and the kind of wounds that time never fully heals. How could a man so admired for grace and humility harbor a ledger of unspoken grudges? How could one of football's most iconic figures, a player who embodied teamwork and unity, be haunted by memories of fractured bonds and bitter clashes? These are the paradoxes that defined Franco Harris, a man who lived at the intersection of glory and grievance. This is not just the story of a running back who became a symbol of Pittsburgh's blue-collar spirit. It is the story of a man who, even decades later, carried within him the 5 hidden truths that shaped his legacy. Truths about teammates who doubted him, rivals who despised him, and decisions from the sidelines and front office that left scars deeper than any hit on the field. As Harris looked back, he finally revealed those truths. They were not confessions born of weakness, but acknowledgments of the struggles that defined him. In uncovering them, we see the man behind the legend, and the dynasty built on both triumph and tension. Franco Harris was not just a player, he was a symbol. Born in 1950, the son of an African-American father who served in World War II, and an Italian mother who carried with her the spirit of resilience, Harris grew up in a world of contrasts. Discipline and sacrifice were the cornerstones of his upbringing, but so too was a quiet determination to carve his own destiny. By the time he reached Penn State, Harris had already developed a reputation as a powerful yet graceful runner. He was not the fastest man on the field, nor the flashiest, but there was a sense of inevitability when the ball was in his hands. He would fall forward, grind through contact, and leave defenders stunned by his balance and strength. Scouts saw a man who could transform a team. Pittsburgh saw a savior. When the Steelers drafted him in 1972, they were still a franchise haunted by decades of futility. Pittsburgh was a city of steel mills, grit, and working-class pride. Yet their football team had long been synonymous with disappointment. Harris became the bridge between that despair and a dynasty that would change the league forever. His arrival marked a turning point, not just in wins and losses, but in the identity of an entire city. Then came the play that would etch his name into history. December 17, 1972. 4th down, seconds left. The Steelers desperate. Terry Bradshaw heaved a pass that ricocheted, and from nowhere Harris appeared, plucking the ball inches from the turf. He ran into the end zone, delivering what would forever be called the Immaculate Reception. That moment was more than a touchdown. It was a rebirth. The spark that launched a dynasty and made Franco Harris an icon of hope. But icons carry weight. Behind the smiles and the trophies, Harris shouldered burdens rarely seen by the public. His running style, upright and methodical, drew criticism, even as it produced results. Some teammates whispered he was too cautious, that he stepped out of bounds rather than take punishing hits. Others questioned his loyalty during contract disputes. Harris, who always believed in principle and respect, saw these doubts as cuts that never truly closed. The Steelers of the 70s became legends. But they were also a band of men forged through fire. Power clashed with ego, loyalty collided with ambition. And even in victory, scars formed. Franco Harris stood in the middle of it all. A figure both revered and resented. A man whose truth was far more complicated than the headlines ever revealed. The stage was set. Glory on one side, grievance on the other. As Harris looked back on his career, 5 moments, 5 relationships, 5 hidden truths would surface. They were not just stories of football. They were stories of betrayal, respect, and the cold reality that even legends carry grudges. Franco Harris and Terry Bradshaw were supposed to be brothers in arms, the backfield and quarterback duo who transformed Pittsburgh from a laughingstock into a dynasty. On the surface, they achieved exactly that. 4 Super Bowl rings, a decade of dominance, 2 names forever linked in highlight reels and championship lore. Yet behind the confetti and parades, their relationship was anything but simple. From the start, Bradshaw and Harris embodied different worlds. Bradshaw was fiery, impulsive, a Louisiana gunslinger with a chip on his shoulder. Harris was quiet, measured, and almost stoic. Where Bradshaw sought the spotlight, Harris let his plays speak. Their contrasts were not just personality quirks. They became dividing lines in the locker room. The root of their fracture lay in respect, or the lack of it. Bradshaw believed Harris sometimes played too cautiously. The whispers around Pittsburgh were that Franco would step out of bounds rather than take a punishing hit, that he protected his body in a way that rubbed against the team's culture of toughness. For Bradshaw, who played through broken bones and constant pain, this felt like a betrayal of warrior code. To Harris, it was survival. He carried the ball more than anyone, bore the brunt of defenses, and he believed his longevity was proof of his wisdom, not cowardice. The tension came to a head in the late 70s, as the Steelers pushed through the grueling battles of the postseason. In one playoff game, Bradshaw yelled at Harris on the sideline after a drive stalled, accusing him of playing soft. Harris responded not with words, but with silence. The kind of cold, deliberate quiet that cut deeper than any shout. Their teammates knew the fracture was real, even as they won together. The iconic Immaculate Reception, ironically, only deepened the divide. Bradshaw delivered the desperate throw. Harris made the miracle play. The world celebrated both, but Harris's name became etched in myth. For Bradshaw, who had fought his whole career against doubters who labeled him dumb and inconsistent, this was another reminder that glory had slipped into someone else's hands. He would later admit that the play defined Harris more than himself, and that truth gnawed at him. By the early 80s, the relationship was frayed beyond repair. Bradshaw's body was breaking down. Harris was locked in contract disputes, and the dynasty was unraveling. In interviews, Bradshaw offered only lukewarm praise of Harris, sometimes even mocking his running style. Harris, in turn, felt the sting of betrayal. For a man who valued loyalty above all else, Bradshaw's dismissive words were unforgivable. When Harris left the Steelers after a bitter contract standoff in 1984, Bradshaw offered no public defense of his longtime teammate. He stayed silent, almost indifferent, as if Harris's departure was just another transaction. That silence spoke louder than any condemnation. To Franco Harris, it confirmed what he had long suspected. Bradshaw never truly respected him. Decades later, in retirement, Bradshaw would soften his tone, admitting admiration for Harris's consistency and impact. But the damage was done. The cold truth remained. Behind the curtain of trophies and memories, Harris carried the quiet ache of knowing his quarterback, his supposed partner in destiny, never stood fully beside him. For Franco Harris, that was a wound that never healed. The Immaculate Reception bound their names forever, but friendship never did. The dynasty lived on in history. Yet the trust between Harris and Bradshaw had died long before. If Franco Harris's tension with Terry Bradshaw was personal, his rift with head coach Chuck Noll was philosophical. Noll was the architect of the Steelers dynasty, a coach who demanded discipline, toughness, and silence. His players often described him as cold, almost detached. A man who believed football was not about personalities but about execution. For Harris, a player who valued loyalty, respect, and dignity above all else, that distant approach created friction. In the early years, their partnership seemed perfect. Noll needed a workhorse running back to anchor his offense. Harris became that anchor, delivering 1,000-yard season after another, keeping the chains moving while Bradshaw developed. The Steelers became bullies of the AFC, and Harris was the hammer. Yet as success mounted, so too did the cracks. The breaking point came in the early 1980s, when Harris and the Steelers front office clashed over money. Harris, who had carried the offense for over a decade, wanted a contract that reflected his value. Noll, ever pragmatic, believed that no player was bigger than the team. When Harris held out before the 1984 season, Noll's response was chilling. He referred to Harris as part of the past. With that phrase, he dismissed the man who had been central to 4 Super Bowl victories, as if he were replaceable. That single word, past, cut Harris deeply. To a man who had embodied Pittsburgh's spirit and carried its hopes, being treated as disposable was a betrayal he never forgot. Harris believed he deserved gratitude for what he had built. Noll believed no sentiment could come before the future of the team. Their values clashed like steel on steel, and there was no reconciliation. The feud reached its climax when the Steelers released Harris just before the season. After more than 12,000 rushing yards in black and gold, he was cast aside with little ceremony. He signed briefly with the Seattle Seahawks, but his heart was never truly there. For Harris, the sting was not only losing his place with the Steelers, it was the manner in which his coach, the man he had followed for over a decade, dismissed him without honor. Even after retirement, Harris rarely spoke ill of teammates or rivals. Yet when the subject of Chuck Noll came up, his voice carried a weight. Respect for the dynasty, yes. Respect for the system, yes. But the memory of being discarded lingered like a scar. In many ways, Harris's departure symbolized the end of the dynasty. The Steelers of the 70s had grown old, their bodies worn. Noll, still chasing the future, believed in moving on. Harris, however, represented more than just a player. He was a bridge between the team and the city, a symbol of loyalty and grit. Releasing him was not just a football decision. It was a fracture in the bond between player and coach. Fans continued to debate whether Harris deserved a different ending in Pittsburgh. Some argued that Noll was right, that sentiment could not outweigh performance. Others saw it as a cold betrayal of one of the franchise's pillars. For Harris, the truth was clear. Chuck Noll may have been a genius, but he was also the man who reduced him to a line in a ledger. The cold truth remained. Franco Harris never forgave the way his coach dismissed him. The dynasty he helped build had no room for sentiment, and that wound never closed. If Franco Harris's grudges with teammates and coaches were personal, his conflict with Al Davis, the owner of the Oakland Raiders, was pure war. The Raiders and the Steelers defined the AFC in the 70s, two franchises locked in a blood feud that blurred the line between sport and battle. And at the center of that hostility stood Franco Harris, the quiet runner whose most famous play ignited the deepest wound of all. The Immaculate Reception in 1972 was not just a miracle. To the Raiders, it was theft. Terry Bradshaw's desperate throw deflected. Harris scooped it inches from the ground, and Pittsburgh's destiny was reborn. Yet, in Oakland's locker room, the play was seen as a fraud. Al Davis never forgave it. He insisted for years that the ball touched the turf, that Harris had been gifted immortality by bad officiating. To Harris, the criticism was not just about one play. It was an attack on his legitimacy, a denial of his role in creating history. The rivalry grew nastier with each passing season. The Raiders prided themselves on intimidation, cheap shots, and a reputation for rule-breaking. Harris represented the opposite. He was measured, dignified, and unshaken. That contrast made him a perfect target. Raider defenders delivered late hits, twisted piles, and whispers designed to break him. Harris absorbed it all with his silent composure. But inside he stored every slight. The defining clash came in the 1974 AFC Championship game. The Steelers and Raiders collided in brutal fashion. Bodies crashing like car wrecks on every play. Harris ran with relentless force, wearing down Oakland's defense, delivering the final dagger with a touchdown that sealed Pittsburgh's rise and the Raiders' humiliation. On the sideline, Al Davis seethed. His empire had been denied once again by the man he loathed most. For years, Davis carried the grudge publicly. He used press conferences and interviews to take shots at Harris, painting him as overrated, as lucky, as a beneficiary of officials rather than a true great. Harris, typically soft-spoken, refused to respond in kind. He let the scoreboard speak. 4 Super Bowls to Oakland's lone title in the decade. But privately, those words stung. For a man who believed respect was earned on the field, Davis's campaign to strip him of credit felt like an attack on his very identity. The bitterness never softened. Even decades later, when the league celebrated the anniversary of the Immaculate Reception, Davis refused to acknowledge it as legitimate. Harris, sitting in interviews with that quiet smile, would insist the play was clean, that destiny had chosen its path. Yet behind his calm demeanor, he knew the feud with Al Davis would never die. The Steelers and Raiders rivalry was larger than one man, but Harris carried the brunt of its weight. To Pittsburgh, he was the hero. To Oakland, he was the thief of glory. Al Davis made sure that label followed Harris long after the games ended. The cold truth remained. For Franco Harris, Al Davis was not just an opposing owner. He was the embodiment of disrespect, a man who sought to tarnish his legacy at every turn. And though Harris never raised his voice in public, inside he carried the quiet fire of knowing that one play, one catch, had made him immortal. and had left Al Davis forever bitter. If Franco Harris carried silent grudges against Terry Bradshaw, Chuck Noll, and Al Davis, his bitterness toward the Steelers' front office was heavier still. It was not just a clash with one man, but with the very institution that had defined his life. For over a decade, Harris had been the heartbeat of Pittsburgh, the man who turned despair into dynasty. Yet when his body began to show the weight of years, the front office treated him not as a legend, but as a number on a ledger. The seeds of conflict were planted in the late 1970s. Harris had carried the ball more than any other Steeler, absorbing punishment that shortened careers. He delivered consistency, over 1,000 yards rushing in season after season, even when injuries mounted. He asked not for glory, but for fair recognition. What he received instead was suspicion. Executives whispered that he was slowing down, that his upright running style would not withstand another season. They began to see him as replaceable. By 1983, tension was high. Harris wanted an extension that reflected his contribution, not only to games, but to the city itself. Pittsburgh's working-class fans wore his jersey. Parents named their children after him, and businesses embraced his name as a symbol of toughness. Yet behind closed doors, the Steelers' front office dismissed sentiment. They believed Harris's production was declining, that paying him would cripple the team's future. Their decision was cold, calculated, and merciless. The breaking point arrived in the summer of 1984. Harris held out from training camp, demanding respect in the form of a new deal. The front office, led by ownership and the personnel department, refused to bend. They saw loyalty as weakness, tradition as a distraction. In their eyes, it was better to cut ties a year too early than a year too late. The dynasty was aging, and Harris became the first sacrifice. The news stunned Pittsburgh. Fans protested, calling radio shows, writing letters, demanding that the team keep the man who had given them everything. But the front office did not yield. Harris was released before the season began. After 12 years, over 12,000 rushing yards, and 4 Super Bowl championships, the Steelers cast aside their symbol of hope. For Harris, the pain was deeper than money. It was about dignity. He had believed in loyalty, in the idea that his devotion to the franchise would be repaid in kind. Instead, he was discarded like a piece of equipment worn beyond use. Signing briefly with the Seattle Seahawks, Harris wore a different uniform, but it never felt real. His heart belonged to Pittsburgh, even if the front office had betrayed him. Decades later, fans still debated the decision. Some argued that the Steelers were right, that football demanded ruthless choices. Others saw it as an unforgivable slight, proof that even legends could be erased by cold accounting. Harris himself rarely lashed out in public, yet his closest friends said he never forgot the sting, that behind his calm demeanor he carried the wound of being abandoned by the institution he had built. The cold truth remained. The Steelers' front office, the very heart of the franchise, had turned its back on its greatest servant. Franco Harris never forgave the betrayal. In the story of his life, it was one of the darkest chapters, a reminder that in the NFL, loyalty is fragile, and respect is often the first casualty. For Franco Harris, perhaps the deepest wound of all came not from teammates, coaches, or owners, but from the media. The press had made him a star, yet it also cut him down, often with ruthless precision. Harris was never flamboyant. He was not a man of bold quotes or heated headlines. He preferred silence, dignity, and consistency. But the media of the 70s and 80s craved noise, drama, and controversy. In that hunger, Harris often became their target. The narrative began as whispers. Writers claimed he was too cautious, that he ran out of bounds to avoid hits. Columnists questioned his toughness, framing him as a back who lacked the warrior spirit of legends like Jim Brown or Earl Campbell. No matter that Harris had shouldered the ball through brutal winters, no matter that his yards carried the Steelers into 4 Super Bowls, the media crafted a story that he was soft, a story that stuck like mud. The criticism intensified during contract disputes. When Harris held out in 1984, reporters framed him as selfish, greedy, and disloyal. They painted him as a man who put money before team, ignoring the decade of punishment his body had endured. Harris watched his reputation, carefully built on humility and resilience, shredded by headlines that reduced him to a caricature. A defining moment came when a Pittsburgh columnist published a blistering piece during Harris's holdout, accusing him of quitting on the city. Fans read those words, and some turned. The cheers grew quieter. The ovations felt thinner. For Harris, it was a betrayal, not just of trust, but of identity. He had given himself to Pittsburgh, body and soul. And yet the media cast him as a villain. Even in retirement, the shadow of those narratives lingered. When anniversaries of the Immaculate Reception rolled around, articles often included a familiar refrain. Franco Harris was great, but not truly elite. They placed him in the shadow of others, framing his greatness as circumstantial, tied to the dynasty rather than his own excellence. Harris knew the truth. His consistency had built the dynasty. His durability had made the impossible possible. Yet the media rarely gave him that credit without attaching qualifiers. Harris responded the way he always had, with quiet grace. He refused to lash out, refused to curse reporters, or demand apologies. But privately, he carried the weight. Friends recalled how, even decades later, he would shake his head when asked about old articles. He remembered every slight, every word that dismissed his courage. The irony is that the very media that criticized him also immortalized him. They replayed the Immaculate Reception endlessly, turned his image into a symbol of Pittsburgh grit, and placed him in the Hall of Fame spotlight. Yet Harris knew their love was conditional. They built him up when it suited their story, and tore him down when it sold papers. For Franco Harris, the press was not just an observer of his career. It was an adversary, a force that shaped his legacy with both praise and poison. The cold truth remained. He never forgave the way the media framed him, never forgave the way they distorted his story. To him, their betrayal was as lasting as any hit on the field. Among all the rivalries and betrayals that shaped Franco Harris, one hidden truth involved a man who was not an enemy, but a brother in the backfield. Rocky Bleier was the other half of Pittsburgh's legendary running attack, a war veteran who fought his way back from Vietnam injuries to become a symbol of perseverance. Together, Harris and Bleier formed a tandem that grounded the Steelers' dynasty. Yet even within that partnership, tension brewed quietly. Harris respected Bleier's courage and admired his comeback, but he also felt that some in the media and the fanbase elevated Bleier's story at the expense of his own. Reporters loved the narrative of the wounded soldier turned champion, and often framed Bleier as the heart of the Steelers' backfield. Harris, who carried the heavier load and bore the brunt of defensive schemes, sometimes felt overshadowed. It was not anger at Bleier himself, but frustration with how others diminished his contributions. The most difficult moments came when people questioned Harris's toughness, while praising Bleier's grit. Harris, who had never missed games lightly and absorbed punishment year after year, carried those comparisons like quiet scars. Though the two backs remained teammates and shared victories, Harris privately admitted that he sometimes felt underappreciated in the glow of Bleier's inspirational legend. Their relationship never turned hostile, and in public Harris always supported Bleier. But the hidden truth was clear. Even among brothers in battle, Harris felt the sting of being underestimated, of having his own toughness questioned while another's was celebrated. It was not a feud born of hate, but of wounded pride. The cold truth remained. For Franco Harris, even friendship carried shadows, and even brotherhood could stir doubt. When we step back from the grudges, the betrayals, and the lingering scars, Franco Harris's legacy takes on a paradoxical shape. He was a man who defined an era of triumph, yet much of his journey was etched in conflict. To understand his true place in football history, one must hold both truths at once: the light of dynasty and the shadows of bitterness. Harris's story begins with the Immaculate Reception, the single most famous play in NFL history. That catch not only saved a playoff game, it resurrected a franchise and gave hope to an entire city. For Pittsburgh, battered by economic decline and the collapse of steel mills, Harris was more than an athlete. He became a living symbol of resilience. In every carry, fans saw themselves, working through pain, refusing to yield. His success was their success, his toughness, their pride. Yet behind that moment of shared triumph lay the seed of many of his grudges. The Raiders never forgave him. Al Davis carried the anger to his grave. And so, the play that built his legend also became a lifelong source of hostility. His relationship with teammates told the same story of duality. With Terry Bradshaw, Harris forged one of the most successful quarterback-running back partnerships in football. But respect between the two men was fragile. eroded by differences in personality and approach. With Rocky Bleier, he shared a brotherhood in the backfield, but also the quiet sting of comparison. Their victories together were real. Yet beneath them flowed currents of mistrust and doubt. His clash with Chuck Noll revealed another layer of his truth. The dynasty's architect saw players as pieces on a chessboard, always replaceable, always secondary to the system. Harris believed in loyalty and respect. When Noll dismissed him as part of the past, it was more than a professional judgment. It was a wound to his identity. The man who had helped carry Pittsburgh to 4 championships was reduced to a footnote in the pursuit of tomorrow. For Harris, this betrayal cut deeper than any tackle. The front office conflict only sharpened that wound. In the cold language of contracts and numbers, they saw a fading veteran. Harris saw a pillar who deserved recognition for all he had endured. The holdout of 1984 exposed the cruel machinery of the NFL. A system where even legends were discarded when their use seemed finished. Harris was left to learn a truth many stars eventually face: that loyalty is not a currency franchises value. The media added salt to those wounds. By questioning his toughness, by framing him as cautious, by praising others at his expense, they distorted the public image of a man who had carried the Steelers for a decade. For Harris, the words written in those columns became heavier than the hits he absorbed on the field. They stripped him of dignity in moments when he needed understanding. To him, their betrayal was the coldest of all, because it shaped the way the world remembered him. Yet through all of these battles, Harris endured. His numbers, his rings, and his consistency speak for themselves. Over 12,000 rushing yards, 4 Super Bowl titles, 9 Pro Bowls, and enshrinement in the Hall of Fame. These are not the marks of a player who ran out of bounds to avoid contact. They are the marks of a man who shouldered responsibility and bore it with grace. Beyond the field, Harris left an impact far deeper than statistics. He became a cultural icon, celebrated not only in Pittsburgh but across the country. He championed community work, stood as a model of discipline, and embraced his heritage as the son of an African-American father and an Italian mother. For many, he embodied the American dream, proof that resilience and humility could build greatness. When Franco Harris passed away in December 2022, just days before the 50th anniversary of the Immaculate Reception, the football world mourned not only a legend, but a symbol of hope. The city of Pittsburgh was draped in black and gold, his jersey number retired, his statue forever guarding the airport. Fans gathered to remember the man who had carried them through their darkest winters. Yet beneath the tributes, the hidden truths still lingered. His story was not just one of triumph, but of tension. Not just of glory but of grudges. That is the paradox of Franco Harris's legacy. Beyond trophies and confetti, it was betrayal and bitterness that shaped him. His greatness was not born in comfort but in conflict. His dynasty was not only about victories, but about the scars that came with them. The grudges he carried were not weaknesses, but reminders of the price of greatness. Franco Harris will forever be remembered as the man who changed the Steelers, the man who brought pride to Pittsburgh, the man who made the impossible possible. But his true story, the one he carried until the end, is that legends are not built by glory alone. They are built by the hidden truths they endure, the wounds they never show, and the battles they fight in silence. Franco Harris's story reminds us that every legend carries shadows. Behind the trophies, the cheers, and the highlight reels, there are struggles, doubts, and wounds that never heal. Harris gave Pittsburgh the Immaculate Reception, the heartbeat of 4 Super Bowl victories, and a legacy that will never fade. Yet he also carried 5 hidden truths, each one shaping the man behind the myth. Now the question is yours. Which of these rivalries, betrayals, or grudges shocked you the most? Was it the cold fracture with Terry Bradshaw, the dismissal from Chuck Noll, the bitter war with Al Davis, the ruthless decision of the Steelers' front office, or the media's relentless criticism that cut deeper than any tackle? Do you believe Harris was right to carry these scars, or should forgiveness have softened the edges of his story? These questions keep the legacy alive. They remind us that football is more than a game of yards and points. It is a human story, filled with triumph and tragedy, loyalty and betrayal. To uncover these truths is to see the real cost of greatness. If you were moved by this journey into the hidden side of Franco Harris, join us here on NFL Hidden Truths. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and and let us know which legend you want to see uncovered next. This is where football's secrets come to light, where the golden age of the NFL is told not in myths, but in the raw, untold truths that shaped its greatest icons. Franco Harris carried those truths to the very end. Now, it is our turn to remember them.